Welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. Thanks for joining us as we continue to talk about different things relating to our Catholic faith. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined, as usual, by Josh Sullivan.
Hello.
Welcome to you, Josh.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Milligan.
Hello.
Welcome to you.
Thank you.
So, very interesting that over the last few months, Pope Francis shockingly, surprisingly, said something that got people up in arms. And it wasn't actually that shocking in my eyes, but people were commenting on it. He was talking about politics, and he was saying how he was sort of answering the question or talking about the question if Catholics should meddle in politics, get involved in politics, weigh in on politics. And he rejected the idea that Catholics should not have anything to do with politics. He was like, of course, Catholics should be right in there with politics. So people were kind of like, what does the Pope mean here? And why did he say something like this? And how far, are people supposed to involve themselves in politics? Anyways, I found it really interesting because that was in about July or August of this past summer that the Pope had said that. And reading about what he actually said and what people's comments about it afterwards were saying, the Pope almost every year, as long as he for his entire papacy, has mentioned this topic. Like if you do a quick Google search for Pope Francis's comments on politics, you'll find a speech of his or
Almost every
single year where he says, no, we have to involve ourselves in the world of politics. And so it surprised me a little bit this year because it's not something new that he's talked about. But I think because in the United States, it's an election year.
Yes.
So things are gearing up and, lots of the debates are happening and speeches and campaign trails are on fire. And so people are in election mood. They're in politics mood. And then in Canada, we've had, so many non-confidence votes that have failed in our federal government that people have election on their mind. Is it going to happen this year? Or do we have to wait till next year? All these sort of things, right? So I think maybe it piqued people's curiosity this time around because of sort of the atmosphere, the environment, the timing that we're in. But people do have questions about this. How much are we supposed to involve ourselves? What does the Pope mean about getting involved in politics? So let's chat about that today because, I would say, if I may sort of start the conversation here, which I already have done, I guess, is there is this idea in people's heads of this separation between the church and the state, separation of church and state, separation of church and government, separation of church and everything else or whatever it might be. So, and I think that's ingrained in people, right? So when someone hears the fact that the Pope's saying, hey, no, go get involved in politics, people are wondering where does that fit in with my already established understanding that the church and the state are to be separate?
Yeah, and people really insist strongly that the church and the state should be separate. And usually you get this from a secular perspective who's kind of looking back on history when, it was problematic that the resources of the church were either at the disposal of the state, which is kind of more common than vice versa, but or vice versa. And they'll point to something like the Spanish Inquisition, where really the church is being leveraged as a body to exercise the will of the state, and it becomes one of these things that becomes a dark part of the history of the church. But the context is widely different. Now we're in for most of our listeners are in a parliamentary democracy. Yeah. So just like that, and the church isn't in a position where it would have that power and that influence anyway over kind of civil democracies. But you get this idea that's like, okay, well, the church shouldn't be involved in the policy decisions, the kind of the legislative practices of government. And looking back on these examples, you can say kind of fair enough, but you can rightly ask the question, or the follow-up question becomes, what's the proper relationship between the church and the state? How do Catholics properly engage in politics? How do we influence, advocate, vote in a way that forms policy in a way that aligns with Catholic anthropology, because. And while I'm at it, you have this kind of idea of the separation of church and state, which was affected by kind of you would say kind of 20th century politics and history. Is like, but the church moved out, but that the government didn't remain neutral. You had a bunch of kind of ideologies move in. So like this kind of utopian idea of the separation of church and state is kind of impossible. Other churches, other belief structures, secularism and materialism have kind of displaced the church as a lot of the kind of governing ideas for policy, and that has introduced arguably much greater problems than.
Yeah, so people who say we're tired of the church influencing the state. The state has now been influenced by other interest groups or other ideologies. It hasn't remained neutral. That's a really good point. Yeah. And I think that as much as the Pope Francis comments have stirred up this topic again, you're right that it's not a new issue, because even Pope Pius XII, who died in 1958, weighed in on this topic about church and state. And he had said that it is not the teaching of the church that the church and the state should be separate. He goes, the church's teaching, influence, respect for life, moral standings, he said, cannot be boxed within the four walls of the church. Yeah. That it has to have an influence on society. And, maybe people were getting tired of sort of a Christian anthropology, maybe. I don't know, but you look at society, our laws are built on Christian values, our other structures in the world are built on our Christian beliefs. So maybe it just came to a point where people were upset, but
democracy itself is
democracy itself.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And now maybe we're at the time where it's like, maybe we're tired of this, but you're right, other things have moved in and taken that role.
I think though that when we're talking about it, I have two feelings. I think church and state, the church should be separate from the state, but the state shouldn't be separated from the church's morality, if that makes sense. And so what I mean by that is that the church always seems to influence us, and specifically if you believe that the church is inspired by the Holy Spirit and that we're under the guidance and of God, following through the Holy Spirit, to instruct us in our morality, then the church is showing us the best way forward in our own lives as Catholics, how we're supposed to live our lives to get to heaven, to be the best, especially even to live in community and to do all that stuff. And so it would make sense that the best way forward for all of humanity would be to follow the same morality and guidelines and stuff. So as a Catholic, it just would make sense that if this is what you believe for your own life, and this is the best thing for your life and the community and everything else, it would just make sense that you would vote similarly to those morals and guides. But what I would like to point out is that the Catholic Church the church itself is never really in Canada, but also I'm going to say the United States, is never on the same side as a one political party. And that's something that is I think a lot of times gets deemed one way or another. The Catholic Church, if you were Catholic, then you are definitely on this side of the fence. And what you realize is that it's not. Like in I'm going to say more left movements, more liberal in Canadian politics anyways, the more liberal movements and stuff, what you see is you have a specific push towards social justice issues. And so there's a lot of money going out to social justice causes. So trying to feed the poor, trying to get more, all these different things. And so they really push the social justice and care for all that kind of stuff. But what happens with that push towards social justice is that they also seem to lose morality as a whole. And so we start having, like you suggested, other ideologies move in, and then they start to push other agendas and other things. And so it kind of falls away from, while the church would definitely support making sure that everybody has health care, making sure that everybody's taken care of, everyone's loved, everyone has housing, everyone has, the church would really agree with that and push those things. Now the church steps in and has to say, okay, but they step in and start talking about abortion. They start talking about marriage. They start talking about the church has to warn the government or warn the people. I'm going to say against these specific movements that are going on that they see going on in the church. Yeah. And so people have the church doesn't agree with that. But when we flip to the right side, some of the morality things seem to line up better. But then the church seems to go on it's again the enemy of the state because it becomes more about social justice issues. Like, no, the rich can't just keep getting richer. The poor can't keep getting poorer. We have to take care of the poor. We have to give health care. We have to do. And so the church kind of steps in on both sides of the fence. And one case is more around, like, agrees with some issues, but then has to steer the people and the government, I guess, in another direction on other issues. But then on the other side of the fence, on, if we have two parties, and we don't technically, we have more than two parties in Canada, but it always seems to, polarize to those two areas. That when we get to the other side of the fence, the church does the opposite. It flips around and says, okay, we agree with you on these things. We potentially agree with your stance on this, that, and the other thing, but we don't agree with these things, and you really have to watch this area. So the church really is apart from the church and state when we come into these two party systems or even these polarized positions in politics. But the church itself should not and cannot be influenced by the politics of the state that it's in.
Well, here's the reason, right? Like the church is built on the foundation of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And
2,000 years
it's
ago.
an apostolic church. It's on the teachings of Christ. So it wouldn't make sense for the church to allow modern day politics, right, to influence the church, even though I'm sure there's, issues in history where people have gotten involved.
There's a human element there
there's a human element, right? Whereas on the other side, you have like the church is people.
Yeah.
And those people who align themselves with the teachings of Christ live in the world. Yeah. Like we live in the world where these issues that you mentioned exist. And so if we're all looking at the world from a Catholic lens, like if I'm a Catholic and I strongly believe in the teachings of Jesus and I agree that I'm convicted that that's what gives me life and that's what God had intended for the world, well, then I look at all these social issues or just worldly issues through that lens, right? So you're always going to have Catholics influencing politics.
Yeah.
But politics
should not
be influencing the church. And yes, Matt, there's a human element to it where sometimes that happens, right? But because Christ doesn't answer to anyone else, right? It's the Lord's will in all these things. And that's why politics shouldn't enter into the church, even though people might say, well, there's a lot of politics in the church, right?
Yeah, I've heard too a lot of times, I think this is part of it. It's because what ends up happening a lot of times is people start to get so involved in the political belief that they leave their faith behind.
Yes.
And so their identity becomes more about being, they have more of a political identity than an identity in faith. Yeah. And so then what ends up happening, and this is not just to laity, like I'm going to say, I've heard some priests and some religious leaders jumping on certain bandwagons and supporting certain political parties and stuff like that. But from my understanding, from the pulpit, the church suggests that you always are supposed to instruct, like you're not supposed to be political from the pulpit. Is that correct? Is that like, we're supposed to be informing your people, you're supposed to inform the congregation or instructing a congregation to make informed, good choices?
Yeah, I would say it depends what people mean by politics, right? Like if someone says, well, Father Daniele, you talked about abortion this week.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to get political. Well, that's not a political issue.
No, that's what the church says. Yeah.
Like for us, that's a life issue. That's a real issue. That's a matter of protecting the most vulnerable. But if I were to stand up and say, everyone in this congregation should vote for this political party.
Yes.
Now that's way beyond. Because you're right. I remember at the last federal election in Canada, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops actually released quite a decent document saying, like, how do we vote in conscience? Yeah. And it was sort of describing a few things you're looking for as a Catholic. What issues should pertain, like what sort of issues should Catholics think about when voting? It didn't endorse any party. It left that for your discernment. And I thought it was quite well done, actually, for the last federal election. So yeah, you are to move people to vote in conscience. First of all, to vote, to vote in general, just to get out there and vote. I think the element that we're missing here, the Pope is saying, yes, we should meddle in politics. Yeah. I think people don't understand. They're just like, oh, a bunch of Catholics have to weigh in on these political issues. Well, I think the church asks us to weigh in on those political issues prayerfully.
Yes.
That's a really important thing. We prayerfully weigh in on political issues, and we're always seeking the common good. Yeah. And I think that's really important for us to reflect on as Catholics who are voting, or Catholics who involve themselves in voting, that we do it prayerfully, we do it for the common good. So if there's an injustice going on, we don't fall silent. I think most people feel more comfortable remaining silent today. So that's why it's kind of hard to get into politics, right? But the problem I think Catholics face is we're not just Catholic inside our church on Sunday, right?
Yeah.
And this is, I think, a problem that Catholics are facing in general today, because it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm a priest, so, I walk around with my collar. People see me as a Catholic everywhere I go. Or on Ash Wednesday, everyone sees all the Catholics around, But from day-to-day life, Catholics are to live their faith in all areas of their life. But it's hard because when you leave the church, sometimes you go home to families that not everyone's practicing the Catholic faith. Sometimes you go to a workplace where no one's practicing the Catholic faith, or the institution in which you work for, has that mentality of like, keep your religion at the door, unless of course you're a special interest group, then please come on in. All these other things so we've been sort of almost formed,
brainwashed.
Yeah, we've been formed to leave our faith within the walls of our church, right? So when we burst through the doors of the church on Sunday, we're all excited and we're saying, God bless you, and I'm going to pray for you, and this and that, and whatever it is. And then when we leave the church and we go to a restaurant, or we go to work, or we go to school or play or whatever it might be, it's like we're two totally different people.
Yeah.
It's like that's the religious side. But that's how people experience living their faith. And it's not how God calls us to live faith. That's why when Pope Francis says we should meddle into politics, it's like we have certain understandings that God has revealed to us that have an importance in the public sphere, right? Yep. So we recently had the life chain in our cities all across Canada, the United States, that where people go out on the streets and prayerfully witness for life from conception to natural death. Catholics are called to do things like that because we stand for life. Yeah. Lots of support from people driving by, but if the church doesn't stand for these things, perhaps the situation would be worse than it is right now, if you could imagine, because it's already pretty bad. But that's why we're called to say, hey, the Lord has revealed certain truths to us, and they're not true just on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Like, they're true always. But we have the responsibility to let it take shape into the world, right?
It's really cool that you say that, because one of the things that is a perfect example is abortion. That the church has always said that we believe that life begins at conception. And it's only been in the last 20, 30, 40 years that we start to realize through our discovery of DNA and our discovery of all those types of things. Like at one time we could say, well, a heartbeat begins at 16 weeks, or we can hear the heartbeat outside at this many weeks or whatever. And so we could say that maybe life begins at that point or whatever, because as certain, but the church has always said it. So scientifically, it only has been the last couple of years that we've been able, or last 20, 30, 40 years, that we've been able to prove that as DNA, that no, you become a separate human being, totally different DNA at the moment of conception. And so now science seems to back that up. And so now the abortion stand doesn't have any legs to stand on to say that, no, well, you are killing a separate human being. You are killing, it's not just tissue, it's not just whatever. You know what I mean? So it's a way that God has directed the church and faith And now sciences seem to come in and back it up.
Yeah.
And now we got to see the laws and rules change on that because
they're not truths just for us.
Yeah, exactly.
They're truths.
Yeah.
It's truth, right?
Yeah.
And science backs that up. I on this topic, I don't want this to turn into an abortion debate, but because people, when we're talking about politics, have criticized Joe Biden,
Yes.
the president of the United States, even though he's kind of disappeared into the background lately while the election's going on. But people say, because he will say that he's a practicing Catholic, right?
Yeah.
So now I think people look to him and say, well, he supports this open door policy on abortion, yet he claims to be a Catholic. So I think there's a few things there that do injustice, right? Number one, it shows other Catholics that you don't have to listen to the teachings of the church, or you don't have to integrate the teachings of your church into your life, right? And to point towards the topic we're talking about today, it backs up that this idea where your faith shouldn't play a role in politics. Now, does Joe Biden have to go out there and pretend like he preached to the American people like he's a priest, and want the Christian, want the United States of America to turn into a theocracy rather than a democracy? No, that's not it. But to go out of your way and say, I'm a practicing Catholic, and then, to say these things that are very contrary to the Catholic faith, it's a scandal for the general public, right? To look at that. But my concern as a priest for Joe Biden and for any politician, I'm just using Joe Biden as an example, my concern is for his own salvation.
Yeah.
Right? A couple weeks ago in the gospel, we said, if you influence others, like if you turn away others from the practice of their faith, what was the gospel there?
It was the children. If you cause the little ones to sin.
If you cause the little ones to turn away from the to sin, it would be better that a millstone will be tied around your neck and thrown into the sea. So there are consequences to our actions that the Lord teaches us. So I would say it's very bold, and almost putting it in the Lord's face to say, look at me, I'm a Catholic, but I'm gonna do my darndest to pass laws that will make this evil a norm in our country. Now, like I said, does he have to go there and restrict abortion and all these different things? That's for his own discernment and for the political party that he belongs to. But he certainly doesn't have to go out of his way to make it known that here I am, a good practicing Catholic in good standing with the church, which, there's danger there spiritually, because someone who causes scandal on a level like he is, especially with encouraging very serious sin like abortion, that can be cause for excommunication, right? And remember, excommunication is not just the church saying you're excommunicated. It's a self-inflicted. It's from your own
church saying,
actions.
hey, because you've done this, you're putting yourself outside of salvation, and so you need to come back and do this.
Yeah. Right? And again, I'm not picking sides here about which political party, but I have been listening a little bit because a couple weeks ago was the vice presidential debate. I see J.D. Vance. He's the vice president for the Republican Party, president candidate. And he is actually a Catholic convert, right? And when you hear him speak, of course, he's a lawyer and has public speaking practice and experience. The way he speaks and the way he just inserts little things into his speech about, well, we pray that God will bless us, or God will direct us in this right path, or whatever it might be. I often say oh, well, he's not. I've never heard him say. I've just never heard him say, I am a practicing Roman Catholic, which he is. He's not gloating about it. He's not touting about it. But even just in the way he converses, you can see that there's a little more mild manner to the approach of church and politics, right?
Yeah, and like we said before, if you are a good practicing Catholic, and then you'll believe that the church, that God has their best will for all people, and so then the church has these things put in place for a reason. And that should come into now. Okay, one of the questions that always comes up: well, aren't they? It's a democracy, so shouldn't he be voting with the will of the people? And so is that what do we do with that type of criticism, I'm going to say?
That's interesting because I think so. The question of whether or not we should be involved in politics is kind of a non-negotiable.
Yeah.
The Pope says we should, and kind of we've established it. But asking the question, what does that look like? Okay, so like yes, we live in a representative democracy. Members of elected officials are represent the body that elected them and the interests that elected them. But there's no particular mandate as a general mandate. So, we can say, okay, how do we get political? Okay, well, we should probably vote. We're like, okay, but how do we advance a Catholic anthropology in the public sphere and not just the private sphere? Like that can look a lot of different ways. Like you can get involved in politics yourself, like J.D. Vance, or become an elected official, just a side note, that like there's a lot of things that maybe look like this that aren't necessarily that like you can like all caps scream at people on social media about the political thing that they posted, which may not be an effective way of promoting Catholic anthropology, but like you can write your MP, you can like you don't need to be this outspoken but like you can say, okay, this is coming up for vote in September. And again, like the other thing that you said is like inform your conscience, inform yourself what's actually going on, what bills are being tabled. If you have the attention span, watch question period. Check it out, get informed, have a good understanding of what the policies are, how they impact the society at large, but how can they either promote the sanctity of life issues, marriage issues, things that our faith informs or should inform. Again, there are ways that we can advance this without necessarily being this stompy, shouty, ineffective.
It's a really good, advocacy is a big thing, right? And I think maybe we shy away from that a little bit. I remember, the Catholic Women's League in Canada, they say that their big thing is advocacy, right? And they say that they have a spot at the table to talk to the government, which is, great, and they take advantage of it. But every year they do a pornography campaign where they, they write the government and to have some restrictions on pornography, which I think is really great. I remember when the medical assistance in dying bill was coming out, there were opportunities for Catholics to write their MPs to say, this is not the right way to go. And then after that law was passed, when they were going to expand the access to medical assistance in dying, there was another opportunity for people to write. So advocacy and different things like this is really good. Yeah, I think there are different levels. And I think for the common person, we're not going to be a J.D. Vance and jump into politics. We're not going to sit through 2 hours of question period because we're going to go insane. But I think for the common person is where are some of the issues that are close to our heart and where can we weigh in? Like right now, for example, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about the hundreds and thousands of people right now living on the street, who the food banks that are just overwhelmed. So how do we get involved there? Well, we can start taking a proactive approach where we're helping in so many different ways. Of course, the Catholic Church is responsible for I don't know what the percentage is. I don't want to say because someone's going to fact check me, but it's a large amount of the charity in the world right now. So that's a way we advocate, right? We petition. We have good relationships with our politicians. And I don't know if you notice, but the general intercessions at Mass on Sundays, the church has sort of a formula for the general intercessions. And you only required to have 4. And I believe the first one is always for the Pope, the church, bishops, The second one is always for politicians and the world. Yeah. And then there's the sick and the dying or whatever it might be. But the church includes intercessions you are to pray. We're to pray for our politicians. Yeah. We're to pray for the advancement of Christ's will in our world. And I think that's something that we often forget. You look at the criticisms around, for example, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. We can have a whole season on what people have said about Justin Trudeau. But how many people can say that they pray for him?
Interesting. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if anyone in this studio right now prays for him. But like, can where do we believe that the Lord helps us? Definitely in the spiritual world.
Yeah.
We should be praying for our elected officials. We should be supporting them. And you know what's really important, I think, too, is a level of respect. We might not like certain politicians, but to be offensive and explicit in our words and all this stuff, it's probably not the best thing to do. I mean, we still have to recognize in each person the dignity that God has, given us just by being created by Him. So there's a lot of ways I think we could enter into politics. I definitely don't think we have to shy away from politics at all. And that's on every level. Your municipal level, your city, your provincial or state level, and your federal level. At all areas of those, I think Catholics should insert themselves. And to get over our own ego, like, oh, I don't want to get involved with politics, or I hate politics, or what am I going to do? I'm just one person. But to start thinking like collectively as Catholics, we could make quite a bit of a difference by our prayer alone, but also by our involvement in certain issues.
Yeah. Now, what do we say? There's two things to bring up here. One is, what if you didn't have something to vote? For instance, in Canada, I'm going to just use and again, not as an abortion topic, but let's say people have a one-topic voting system. So abortion is the only way, and so if we have Trudeau, who has said, or we have one party, I'm going to just say, that has said, okay, no, we think that abortion should be, and we're going to fight for the right that everyone can have an abortion whenever they want, yada yada yada. And then you have another one that says we're not opening the topic up again. Well, for a lot of people, I find that they shut down. Then, okay, I can't vote for anybody but I remember listening, and I think this question was asked of our bishop actually, in a Q&A session in front of our church, one of the missions. And one of the things he said made sense, because it formed through the Catechism, and the Pope has written on this too, which was, you are instructed to vote, and there's two ways to do it. One is to go in and vote, and decide you don't spoil your ballot, because spoiling your ballot just throws it in the garbage. But to say, I decline to vote, that actually means something. That's a really big signal. And if enough people do that, then they're going to catch the hint that we don't agree with anything that's really going on now in our political system. And so that's a really big thing that we can do in Canada. I don't know about the other systems, but that's a big thing. And so that does make a statement. And that's still, I would suggest, within your right to vote. And if enough people do it, that makes a big statement to the Canadian parties, all of them. But the other thing is to vote for the lesser evil. Yes, if there's not a political system, it's not a party that's saying that I am going to open up the abortion topic and ban abortion. Or if and this happened in Canada when they said, the party came up and said, I'm going to ban abortions after 14 weeks of pregnancy. And the advocacy groups came forward and said, well, then we're not going to vote for you because you're not going to ban abortion completely. Well, then what happened? They didn't win, and now abortion's open to everybody, and so you vote for the lesser of the evils that you can. I mean, if you're voting with your conscience, you're voting for the least amount, which is if someone's not going to change the rules and one is going to get it worse, then vote for the one that's not going to change, and then kind of vote with your conscience that way.
And sorry, just to say that I think this is one of the things that discourages people from getting into politics, because they'll say, okay, I've been looking at the policy positions and the platforms of each of and unfortunately, is less the case in Canada, but in the States, you effectively have a two-party system. Yeah. Like you're kind of choosing between the lesser of two evils. And this recently came up as part of the kind of the U.S. Election, the campaign trail, that pro-life advocacy groups in the States are kind of torn, because the one party that you would expect to just kind of throw all of the life issues out the window is the clear choice for not who not to vote for. Yeah. But you have Republicans, and in recent years you have the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Like, okay, so there's been progress made on the pro-life, but you also have strong advocation of IVF. Yes, because voting on the side of life life is the category of life is much bigger than just abortion, even though abortion is probably the biggest one, but like things like the death penalty. And so like, so for Catholics to inform their conscience, to inform themselves on the issues, it's not just a clear case of I'm not voting for this person, so I'm voting for the other. You really have to, go to the effort of like, okay, which of the choices that are available to me is going to do the most good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed. And we're going to pause the conversation there because we're out of time. So I hope maybe this conversation may have brought up some good points for people to reflect on. And if you want to meddle in our conversation here, you can add a comment or drop us an email at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com. You can also like this episode of The Catholic Buzz and share it with those around you. That's all the time we have today. So for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.